We talked about the precursors of structuralism, and while talking about precursors of structuralism, we discussed the work of Italian thinker Vico. And Vico, is a very important name in the history of structuralism if we trace the roots of structuralist stances. So Vico we discussed. After discussing Vico, we turn to Jean Piaget. And Piaget, is important because he talks about structuralism not only in linguistics, but also in sciences and social sciences. That means he gives us an idea about the scope and range of structuralism. And there we learned this lesson that structuralism can be discussed in plural terms, or it can be described in plural terms. So structuralisms and structuralist responses to the world. And structuralism talks about not only one particular subject, but possibly our responses to the world. And hence his interest in different fields. There was another point of discussion, and that point of discussion was whether structuralism should be considered a method of inquiry or it should be considered a movement of mind. So when structuralism is considered a movement of mind, something that we did, something that we did when we were discussing Vico, when we were discussing Jean Piaget, and when we were discussing certain aspects of structuralism which have a kind of philosophical basis. And there we discussed the state of knowledge at the beginning of the 20th century and as it emerged from late 19th century. So what was the nature of that knowledge? Knowledge appeared fragmentary. Fragmentary means divided into fragments. So that was the entire state of knowledge when structuralism arrived on the scene. It talked about a coherent kind of system, a system where different fields could be combined, or a system viewed in terms of relationships. So not something like that there is an object and that object exists independently, but rather the relationship between different objects. So structuralism sought meaning in structuralism sought meaning. Just a minute, there is some password. Right. There was some problem of password from another group. They're joining us, so we had this little interruption. So when we discuss structuralism as a movement of mind, we talk about structuralist responses, we talk about Vico's ideas, we talk about the fragmentary nature of knowledge, which was the case at the beginning of the 20th century. So structuralism sought a kind of coherent system. There was another important philosophy that was Marxism. Marxism also stayed away from that isolated nature of knowledge, and Marxism also sought some kind of, say, sustenance in connected narratives. In other words, seeking connections between different entities. So structuralism and Marxism, in a way, they share this ground. And of course, there is something else also. And what is that thing? That structuralism is just a minute. Okay. That structuralism, when we say that structuralism is a method of inquiry, there we are saying that structuralism is a method which can be used to understand and to interpret works of literature and possibly other cultural narratives, cultural objects, or any aspect of culture, be it a myth, be it an object, be it an artwork, be it any piece of literature. So that was structuralism as a method and structuralism as a movement of mind. Since we are students of literature, we'll be talking about structuralism as a method a great deal. And you know that, so this realization that knowledge is not fragmentary led this movement called structuralism. Then, of course, there are some other parallels also where you can talk about, say, nature of knowledge, which is not fragmentary. And Marxism is one, and of course, Chomsky's universal grammar is another. And another important approach which has something common or which shares some ground with the structuralism is Northrop Frye's archetypal approach. I discussed that also, that Northrop Frye was interested in a kind of grammar of literature, laws of literature, rules of literature. And there he sought those rules in some of those myths and archetypes which recur again and again, again and again. So for example, any archetype, master archetype, the archetype of a wise old man, or the archetype of a temptress, right? Or a particular pattern, like pattern of a particular hero who moves from innocence to experience. Fry talks about some archetypal patterns which are repeated again and again, which recur again and again, and which we encounter in different forms in literature, in cultural myths, in films, in all those places. So Northrop Frye was seeking a kind of criticism which was different from new criticism, which talked about individual works and which in a way focused on isolated nature of knowledge. What else was there in Northrop Frye? Northrop Frye tried to talk about certain modes of writing. And what are those modes of writing? Some of those modes of writing, you can say there is the comic mode, there is the romantic mode, there is the tragic mode, and there is the ironic mode. So all writings, all works of literature, all, say, cultural expressions in the form of narratives, they can be discussed in terms of this grand theory of modes. So there will be a major character or a hero in a comic or in romantic play or in tragedy or in an epic or say a work which is satirical, and this hero also has certain characteristics. So as we discussed, that in a low comedy, hero is inferior to, say, ordinary people like you and me, but hero is on the same page as all of us if it happens to be a tragedy, although in that tragedy hero is not above his environment. And of course in many of those plays which are based on myths, or in myths, you can say hero is superior in kind to all other people. Fry says that these patterns recur again and again in literature, in narratives. And so if we study these patterns, we can probably understand any work of literature. So Fry provides a kind of grand framework, and that grand framework helps him explain all works of literature. In one loose sense, you can say that Fry's approach is also structural, that he is talking about structure of literature. And here he is talking about a structure of literature with reference to his grand theory of modes, his grand theory of archetypes, and he also relates this theory of archetypes of modes to four different seasons. So one particular season corresponding to winter, corresponding to something, summer corresponding to something. That means modes of writing also correspond to seasons. We leave Fry here at this point because Fry, his work appeared in 1957 and he is an important name. But still, when we talk about structuralism proper, structuralism as we understand the word, then structuralism also has one very important principle. It also has a very important idea, a very important concept behind it. And that concept is not there in Fry. That idea is not there in Fry. That idea comes from Ferdinand de Saussure. So Fry's work appeared at the same time as these card carrying structuralists were emerging, when structuralism proper was emerging. And this is structuralism which is inspired by the concepts which were developed by Ferdinand de Saussure. Right. Now, in just 1 minute's time, I'll talk about some other development which will take place from here onwards, and then I'll come back to Ferdinand de Saussure. You see, Ferdinand de Saussure influenced, first of all, Russian formalist, which was also a movement which was taking place in Russia in 1920s. He also influenced some writers who are associated with a particular school called Czech school, which had its center at Prague. So Prague or Czech structuralism. Saussure influenced them. Then there is another current of structuralism that comes from the United States of America. Some linguists, they were working on Indian languages. So they somehow reached certain conclusions about the nature of language, which is strikingly similar to Ferdinand de Saussure's conclusions. But those linguists were operating independently in United States of America. Because after the First World War, there was a break in the journey of people and also journey of ideas. So many linguists in America, they were developing those ideas, but they were developing those ideas independently. It happens so often that two similar ideas come from two different places, and two different theories may possibly develop something independently without knowing each other. So this was the case here also. And you know that influence of Ferdinand de Saussure is very, very vast. So Russian formalism that way, and of course Czech structuralism, and later you see when he will be translated into English, then his work also exerted great influence in the English speaking world, that is United States of America and Britain. But this will not happen before the late 50s. So we should be very clear about these dates also, that his influence will become important in the English speaking world in 60s, after the translation of his work appeared in English. His influence was there in Russia already, or on Czech structuralism already. And many similar ideas were developed on the soil of the United States of America, but they were independent of Saussure's influence, right? So structuralism has a very broad field, it has a very broad range, and this will give you some idea that how broad it was, not only Europe but also United States of America. So now we come back to Ferdinand de Saussure, and we see how his ideas, or how the concept that he developed, they are important, and what are those concepts. I'm very sure you have already come across his concepts in different papers. You have already learned something about Ferdinand de Saussure, because his ideas are available, the concept that he developed are available in most primary books of theory. But as you know that when we discussed abstract ideas, repetition of those ideas also helps in understanding those ideas. So maybe if you read something 10 times, if you read that particular thing, say 15 times, then your understanding will only grow. Now, what is the time period of Ferdinand de Saussure? You can remember this, that he was born the same year when revolt of 1857 happened. That means 1857. Good way to remember. And he died in 1913. And he delivered some lectures between say 1905 and 1911. And where was he working? He was a Swiss linguist, Swiss from Switzerland. And what else? He knew Sanskrit. He taught Sanskrit also. So he was a real linguist. Sanskrit was a language in which he specialized. And of course, he was also talking about the nature of language. Lectures which were delivered during that period were later compiled by his students. And then that book, which is based on his lectures, is titled Course in General Linguistics. Course in General Linguistics. Now, what is important about Ferdinand de Saussure? You see, when he appeared on the scene, there was a particular state of knowledge. As I mentioned earlier, we talked about fragmented nature of knowledge. What is the word which can stand in opposition to this fragmented nature of knowledge? You can say relational nature of knowledge. Relational nature of knowledge. That means we are seeking some kind of relationship between two entities which appear different but which nevertheless have a relationship. So this relational view of language is something which defines Ferdinand de Saussure's work. Yesterday I said that if there is one word which you can use to talk about structuralism, then that one word will be relationship. So relationship is a key word in structuralist theory. And Saussure had a relational view of language. Furthermore, he considered language a kind of unified field. And it is also protected from outside in the sense that it is a self-sufficient system. And because it's a self-sufficient system, how should language be studied? This was a question. Saussure believed that there are two aspects of language. And of course, these two aspects you know very well. One is you can study language in a historical perspective, and the other is you can study language in terms of its currency at a certain point of time. So historical nature of language or historical scholarship was very much in vogue when Ferdinand de Saussure appeared on the scene. How is language studied in historical terms? And there is a word which is used in Saussure, diachronic. So diachronic may appear to be a very, say, high sounding word. Literally, it means something seen in historical perspective. So historical and diachronic, they are the same. Now, what is this diachronic view of language? What is this historical view of language? It means we maybe study a word, for example, we study a word, then we see the history of that word, how that word meant something maybe 100 years ago, how that word had a particular kind of origin at a particular point of time, how that particular word is pronounced today and how it was pronounced earlier, how it is spelled today and how it was spelled earlier. What are the roots of this word? Often many words have Latin roots, many English words, they have Latin roots. So when we are studying language historically, when we are studying language in diachronic terms, we are looking at the history of that word, the history of its meaning, the history of its sound, the history of its spelling. There is one very powerful document, you can say, which records this kind of historical scholarship. And that document is Oxford English Dictionary. And you know that Oxford English Dictionary is a very old document. It has been evolving for centuries. So Oxford English Dictionary often gives you the root of that word. And many other dictionaries also give you an idea about the root of a particular word. So root and its earlier meanings and so on. Saussure did not discredit historical scholarship. Please remember, he did not discredit that scholarship. He did not consider that unnecessary. Rather, there is another dimension of scholarship which Saussure very strongly emphasized. And what was that? Language synchronic dimension. So there are two words, diachronic and synchronic. They are seen often in opposition to each other. Diachronic is historical and synchronic is its currency at a particular point of time. So synchronic here means if we are studying English language today, then we see how a word means what it does. We also see how it has different meanings even today. How this word means something in India and how this word means something maybe in United States or in Australia. And you have many examples where one word has a particular meaning in England and other meaning maybe in the United States of America. So this difference in the variety of English, American English and Indian English, or say English, say which is used in other countries. And that's why today we also have this notion of Englishes. To just give you one example, many Indians do not understand the meaning of the word sundry. Sundry. So whenever you tune to cricket commentary and you say that that Kohli is on 30, Pujara is on 50, and India's total is 160, and there are 10 sundries. 10 sundries. Now sundries, Australian commentators use the word sundries. It means extras. So extra runs. English commentator or Indian commentator will often use the word say extras. Say extras contributed to India's victory. But Australians will use the word sundries. So when we are discussing diachronic nature of scholarship, we are discussing something in historical perspective. When we are discussing something in a synchronic say perspective, then we are talking about the current variety, current uses of language. So for Saussure, this was important, current uses and current currency of language. This is very important because language current structural properties, current structural property are important. And what is that current structural property? Say word used here and its relationship to other words, or how language is used in different places at the same time. There is another assumption here, and that assumption is that language is always complete. Language is always complete. So in the year 2020, language, English language, you can say, or if you like, say, talk about your mother tongue, that is always complete. And if you talk about somebody like Munira ma'am who knows 10 languages, then all those 10 languages are also complete at any point of time. So what is, say, implied by this? It also means that language was also complete 100 years ago. And language was also complete 200 years ago. And when we say that language is complete, always complete, then we are coming back to that notion of language being a kind of structure in terms which were used by Jean Piaget. So if we say that language is complete today, that means it has taken into its fold all possible transformations. In the last 20 years, you can say that internet has changed the nature of English language, or information technology has changed English language. When World Wide Web, that means your internet, first entered the scene, it was in 1995. And you see that language change. There is a whole range of vocabulary which comes from information technology. But there are also other occasions when language undergoes a change. If you just analyze words which are contributed by Hollywood films and Hollywood, say, Hollywood inspired serials, you see that they have also contributed to English language. And similarly, war, for example, say Gulf War added number of new terms to English language. And so is the case, it always happens. And you also have some different kinds of structures also today. Structures where you see that language was not used earlier like this. Often purists, those who believe in the purity of language, they say that oh, language is being corrupted, that young people are speaking in say using lots of abbreviations, and this is spoiling the language, or SMS has a particular kind of language, or email has given a particular kind of language, or for that matter social media is interfering with our language. But actually this is also part of the evolution of language, because earlier also language behaved very differently. Now how many of you know, say for example, we use the word fan very often, fan, right? And fan comes from the word fanatic. So if you say that I am a cricket fanatic, you are being formal. If you say I am a cricket fan, then you are using language maybe in a more informal manner. Or the word, the dreaded word, say flu, it comes from influenza. So that means this aspect of language where which is called clipping, this was there earlier also. It is only this that now this clipping probably exists on a wider scale. So language is always was complete, language is complete, language will be complete, language takes into its fold all those changes, transformations which Jean Piaget mentioned. And language is complete, whole, that means we are talking about language as a structure, so it is whole, Jean Piaget. It has transformational properties. And so we see. And it is also kind of self-sufficient system. This is also important that say language is always complete. So if new words are being added, then it is the grammar of language. It is the intrinsic laws of language which somehow make it possible for language to adopt those things. So it becomes a self-sufficient system also. So that means here Saussure is talking about language. He is taking a relational view of language, and he is focusing on synchronic study of language because language is always complete. There are, of course, three levels of linguistic activity. Again, another concept I am introducing. There are three levels of linguistic activity. Linguistic activity, something that has something to do with language. One is language, L-A-N-G-A-G-E, language, L-A-N-G. It refers to entire human potential for speech. That means all human beings have this potential for speech. So this is one level. This is one level of linguistic activity. What is this? This human potential for speech. Whatever be your language, whatever be your mother tongue, this human potential for speech is something common to all human beings. That is one important linguistic activity. The second important linguistic activity is long, L-A-N-G-U, long, and third is parole. So long basically refers to a kind of language system. English, long. English is a language system. French is a language system. Urdu is a language system. So that is long, lang. And the third is parole. Parole is an individual utterance. So let us just view this again. We all have human potential for language because we are human beings. We have this potential for language that is common to everyone. That is one level. Second level, we speak one particular language. We know particular language that is long. So if I am talking to you in English, I am familiar with the long of English. But if I make a sentence and I say that I'm writing this, this is an example of parole. So parole is an isolated instance of language use, a kind of utterance. Any sentence for that matter you utter, that is an example of parole. So if, for example, somebody from this group speaks a sentence in Assamese, obviously many of you who don't speak Assamese won't understand that sentence. Maybe if you try hard enough, you can remember that sentence and you can repeat. A parrot often repeats something that he hears. But what is the difference between a parrot repeating a sentence and a human being speaking a language? The difference is in the area called long. Somebody who knows a language is familiar with the internal rules of that language that somebody has learned. Somebody has learned and somebody has probably learned because one is a member of society. So long means all those rules of language, all those structures of language, and all other things. That means it is because of our knowledge of those rules of language that we are able to speak language. So if you are speaking Urdu, obviously you speak Urdu because you are familiar with all possible rules of Urdu language. Say even Donald Trump can often come out with a sentence in Hindi. But that is an example of parole. He does not know long. He does not know the rules of Urdu language or Hindi language. So that means we are talking about three different levels of language. One is this human potential for speech, which all of us have as members of society. And second is our knowledge of those internal rules of language, that is long. And the third is, say, individual instance of speech, that is parole. Parole. So long and parole, they are important. Saussure also laid great emphasis on long. That means he's saying that if we study parole, then study of parole can be very chaotic because all of us can produce any number of sentences. But long is basically that internal knowledge of rules. Now, something else also here. We don't have too much time, so it can go off any minute. So I'll just say that just a few things. So when we say that long is knowledge of language, knowledge of its rules, but that knowledge, all of it is not in use always. And Saussure gives the example of a game of chess. If you play game of chess, there are certain rules which are in operation, but all those rules are never in use. All those rules are never in use. Maybe when you make a move, a certain rule comes into being, a certain rules is used, and rules exist, but a particular move is like a parole. So we can also say that long is like that mountain of ice which remains hidden from the view when we see an iceberg, and only its tip is visible. That is parole, you can say. So here we stop at this point because it is just going off, and we will meet after say 10-12 minutes. Enjoy your cup of tea. Meanwhile, for just a few seconds, I can. So we were discussing concepts which were developed by Ferdinand de Saussure and which had some very powerful impact on the course of literary studies later. And we have already talked about a few things that Saussure had a relational view of language. That is one important point. Then Saussure also talked about language being a kind of unified field. Another important point. Saussure emphasized a synchronic study of language. That means study of language say, at a particular point of time, and say in terms of its present currency. And furthermore, we say that Saussure also discussed say levels of linguistic activity. And what are those three levels of linguistic activity that we can identify? One is human potential for speech. The second is long, that is say our knowledge of rules and structure of language that we know because we have learned a particular language. And third important aspect is parole. So basically these two words are important, long and parole. And long, knowledge of the rules of language, knowledge of the codes of language, and parole, individual example of a sentence or an utterance or a particular use of language. What is important here is that for speaking a sentence, you must have idea, you must have mastery of rules of language. So it is the knowledge of those rules which enable you to possibly utter a single sentence or to speak language in a coherent manner. Now we come to say another aspect of this theory. Saussure also talked about what is called signifier and signified, and again something that you have encountered again and again. He talked about what is called sound image of a word, and then the concept which is attached to that word. In other words, there is a particular sound image and there is a particular meaning, a concept attached to that word. Signifier is that sound image. So if I say cup, that is a signifier. If I say for example a book, then it is again an example of a signifier. Now the fact that this book means this and not this, it is just matter of convention. Maybe if a book had meant this, what I have in my hand, even this would have been considered perfectly natural. But the thing is that book started meaning this, or book had a particular concept attached to it. When we think about a book, we think about this particular thing. So this sound image of a book and a particular thing which is attached to that book, the concept. This is a relationship which is a matter of custom, which and a different custom would probably have given a different concept to the sound image. So that means there is nothing natural about a particular signifier meaning a particular thing, a signified. So basically signifier is that sound image and signified is the concept attached to that sound image. In simple language, you can say that a word and its meaning. A word and its meaning. Now, there is another aspect of this, and that aspect is that this relationship between signifier and signified is purely arbitrary. Arbitrary means that there is no basis for a particular signifier to mean something. It is simply a matter of custom. Then we come to another aspect of Saussure theory. There is a sound system of language. And in the sound system, there are differences in sounds. And those differences in sounds are systematized. And when they are systematized, they give different words which mean something. I'll explain this. If I say that I want a cab, C-A-B, cab, you understand the meaning of the word cab. Now, in the word cab, there is this initial sound ka. Suppose I say that I want a car. Now, car and cab, C-A-R-C-A-B. That means ba sound at the end is replaced by ra sound. Or if I use the word cat and I use the word bat and I use the word rat and I use the word mat, then in all these words, cat, bat, mat, rat, and you can possibly add more words. The initial sound is replaced by another sound. So cat, ka. Ka replaced by ba, bat. Ba replaced by rat, ra. So when these sounds are replaced by other sounds, we get a new word which means something. So that means there are sounds in a language and these sounds stand in opposition to other sounds. So ra stands in opposition to ba, ba stands in opposition to say ka, ka stands in opposition to ma. This is what is called a kind of binary opposition in which these sounds are held. Furthermore, we can also say that this change in phoneme, that is the smallest unit of sound, brings about a change in that word. But what is important here is, and this is extremely important, that all sounds which are different do not necessarily distribute meaning. I am explaining this. You see, in any language, there are certain sounds which are recognized as proper sounds and which distribute meaning. In any language, there are sounds which are recognized and which distribute meaning. But there may be some sounds which are there, which are different, but these different sounds may not give or may not distribute meaning. I give you an example of the sound pa. In many cases, when Arabic speakers speak, some Arabic speakers speak, they are not able to pronounce pa sound. So, funny enough, if you say that, are you braying? So, are you braying actually means, are you praying? Or this sound that, did you have Pepsi? So, thing is that this pa sound is not there in that language, and hence pa sound does not distribute meaning in that language. Similarly, in English, there may be some sounds which appear different, but which are considered all the same, which do not distribute meaning. And that's why any language recognizes only limited number of sounds. There may be any kinds of sounds if we take into account all possible languages. And that is why when you speak as a foreign speaker English language, your speech sounds a bit foreign. Why does your speech sound foreign? Because you are probably using certain sounds which are not recognized by that language. So what is of interest here is that language follows this kind of system of rules where sounds are held in opposition to each other, where sounds distribute meaning, where the difference of one particular phoneme can bring about change in meaning, and where you can see that say permutation and change of phoneme. Phoneme means minimal unit of sound. It brings about change in the word. So bat, cat, rat, mat, these are sat. These are all separated by just one phoneme, one sound. But this change brings about change in meaning. So here Saussure is talking about the relational view of sound. Relational view means it's a relationship of one sound to another sound. Relationship of ba to sa to ka, and so on. Furthermore, we can say that it is because of the structural nature of language that we see this relationship. Now, another point which is worthy of note is that when Ferdinand de Saussure appeared on the scene, there was a particular view of the world. And what was the view of the world? Item-centered view of the world, where one word was considered important. One word was considered important. And so that word could be studied. Saussure, say, emphasized relational view of the word, where the relationship of one word to other words became important. So just as there is the relationship of one sound to another sound, where you see that relational view of language, similarly the relationship of one word to another word, relationship of one word to another word, where you see this relational view. And to understand this, we come to another dimension of language that Ferdinand de Saussure emphasized. And what is that? He talked about two different pools of language which exist in time and space, which have a temporal and a spatial nature. One is called syntagmatic and the other is called paradigmatic. I'll explain these two words. Syntagmatic aspect of language. Syntagmatic aspect of language, and the other is paradigmatic aspect of language. Syntagmatic comes from the word syntag, which means part. Paradigmatic comes from the word paradigm, a pattern, you can say. Now, when we speak a sentence consists of number of words. Each word is related to the other word in the sentence, and that is how possibly we make sense of a word. If I say that I am drinking tea, then I am drinking tea. I am drinking tea. These are four words, and these four words make this simple sentence. But important thing here is that I is related to am, to drinking, and then to tea. It is only when we see all these syntax, all these parts, that we understand this sentence. So this is the syntagmatic aspect of language, where we see all words which are placed, say, side by side, all words which probably exist in time. When you say speak a language like this, there can be a long sentence also. In the year 1919, when I was placed in Burma, I witnessed a scene which is still etched in my memory, a memory which is terrible, a memory which is bad, a memory which does not give me any moment of peace. I can go on. This sentence, so it can be a very long sentence. But again, if you read this entire sentence, so it exists in time. When I was speaking, I uttered a word and then another word and then another word. But so this is the syntagmatic aspect of language, where you see all these parts, but they constitute a sentence and they constitute some kind of meaning. On the other hand, the other pole of language, and what is that other pole of language? Paradigmatic pole of language. It means all those words, all those items of language which are not part of the sentence, which do not appear on the scene, but which nevertheless have helped in choosing these words. Again, to come back to that simple example, I am drinking tea. When I say I am drinking tea, the word tea I could have used the word coffee, I could have used the word say cold drink, I could have used the word wine, I could have used the word Pepsi. That means there are any number of words which were not used, but which also have a relationship with the word which is used. So there is this relationship between the word which is used and the words which are not used. In other words, we selected a word, made a choice. All those words which are not used, they can be synonyms, they can be antonyms, right? All those words which are not used, they can be synonyms, they can be antonyms, they can be words of similar sound, they can be words of similar sound, or they can be words which perform the same grammatical function. I repeat, when I say that I enjoy this class, I enjoy this class. So the word enjoy is a verb. Enjoy is a verb. Now I can possibly think about another word which is its synonym. I enjoy this class. I relish this class. There is also an antonym of this word enjoy loosely. I hate this class. So I did not choose the word hate. I did not choose the word relish. And there can be a word say which has the same grammatical function. I I love this class. So there are number of words which had not been used, and these words can be words of the same sound, that means similar sound, words performing the same grammatical function. They can be words which may be antonyms or words which may be synonyms and so on. So this is the other dimension of language, syntagmatic dimension and paradigmatic dimension. And here also you see a relationship. Relational view of language we are emphasizing. And what is this relational view? That means the word which is used and the words which are not used. This relationship, paradigmatic relationship. And the word which is used and the word which is placed next to it, syntagmatic relationship. So when we discuss Ferdinand Saussure, we are discussing his relational view of language. When he appeared on the scene, there was the item-centered view of the world. He emphasized syntagmatic, he emphasized synchronic study of language. He did not discredit diachronic, but emphasized synchronic study of language. He emphasized relational view of language, where one particular word gets its meaning because of its difference from other words. One word gets its meaning. The word bat means what it is because it is not cat. The word cat gets its meaning because it is not rat. So that means this difference in sounds creates meaning. Saussure also said that in language there are differences without any positive terms. What does it mean? It means that it is a matter of choice whether you consider, say, cat important or rat important. Say it is a question of semantics. As far as language is concerned, in language there are differences but without any positive terms. When we say that in language there are differences without positive terms, we are saying that language is following a certain mechanism. It is following a certain, say, system of rules. So this question of whether something is good or bad, this question of evaluation is not important there. So to just sum up quickly Ferdinand de Saussure, his relational view of language, his relational view of word, word and its relationship to other words in the same sentence, word and its relationship to all those words which have not been used, synonyms, antonyms, words of similar sound, words performing the same grammatical function, right? And further, you can say that he emphasized this aspect of language where language is self-sufficient and self-defining. What language refers to is not reality. What language refers to is to itself. Remember Jean Piaget's view of structure. Structure is whole. So for Saussure, language is always complete, whole. And each part in a language, a word, in itself, probably it may not amount to much. But when we consider a word, then that word, because it is related to all other words, so it is a part, but this part has greater weight than if it is considered independently. So what is the view of Jean Piaget? Language, or rather structure, presents the idea of wholeness. That means this is an important property of structure, that there are parts constitute a whole, but a single part or a part has a weight beyond its original weight because it is seen in relation to other parts. So it is only when we emphasize the relationship of those parts that a part achieves some kind of eminence. So in language, whether it is a word or it is a sound, that word or that sound can be considered a part, but it is related to all other parts. And so language makes a kind of whole, idea of wholeness. Then idea of transformation. Language is always complete. It has taken into its fold all those changes in sound, in rules, in grammatical patterns, and it exists always complete. It has already always taken note of all those changes. And third, it is a kind of self-sufficient system. It is working by its internal logic, by its mechanism, by its own mechanism. So this fact that language, word and its meaning, there is a kind of arbitrary relationship. A cup means this cup, not this book. This relationship is arbitrary. And why? Because language is a kind of self-sufficient system. So in Piaget's terms, if we talk about language as a structure, then Ferdinand de Saussure's work actually appears a kind of where language is a structure, and that's why Ferdinand de Saussure is considered a structuralist thinker, right? Because he is talking about relationships. He's talking about relationships of words, relationships of sentences, relationships of sounds, and relationships of two different poles, syntagmatic and paradigmatic. So you understand that in this entire discussion, some words occurred again and again. Relational view, structural view, structure. Language is a structure. Language is a structure because it is whole, because it is capable of transforming itself, and it is self-sufficient. Right. Now, if we talk about structuralism further, then we'll say that structuralism appeared on the English literary scene in 1960s. Right. But there was another very powerful movement in Russia, and that was called Russian formalism. You know that Saussure had great influence on Russian formalists. But there is one major difference. In Russian formalism, you do not have this view that language has a differential nature. That means when you compare two words, bat and rat, and we talk about difference in meaning. Now this difference in meaning because of sound, this idea is not there in Russian formalism. But Russian formalism also talks about certain laws, certain rules, a certain kind of mechanism, which you can see in works of literature. So they were basically interested in this basic question: what is literary? What is literariness? And they wanted to talk about certain laws, certain rules, a certain grammar, which could probably explain works of literature. So here in intention, you see, it is not very different from the work of Northrop Frye. Northrop Frye also wanted a kind of grand narrative of rules, grand narrative of laws, which could explain all works of literature. Russian formalists were also interested in laws of literature, in rules of literature. That means, what is it which makes something literary? So this basic question. If a particular work is considered literary, if a poem is considered literary, if a novel is considered literary, then what exactly is literariness? What exactly are the qualities which make this work literary and other works probably not literary enough to be considered literary? So this was one basic question. And the search for the answer gave some very interesting concepts. And those interesting concepts define Russian formalism. Now, what are some of those things? We will quickly come to that point. But before that, we must talk about some other aspects of language, because we are talking about structuralism, we are talking about, say, a structural view of language. So here we survey the entire scene in Europe, in United States of America, and of course in Russia, which is also part of Europe, but usually Europe connotes Western Europe. And we are also talking about the continent. And you also have another paper that is being studied, say linguistic turn in criticism, something. Now here we can talk about three varieties of linguistic study in the 20th century. Three varieties of linguistic study. One is descriptive, one is glycematic, descriptive, glycematic, and one is functional. Descriptive, glycematic, Glassematic, glycematic, and third is functional. What are they? First, we must deal with descriptive linguistics. We have about say 10 minutes, so maybe I can just complete this point. So what exactly is descriptive linguistics? Here we are talking about some American structural linguists, some American structural linguists. Their study had a context, and the context was, if you know United States of America, you know that America is not simply the home of white settlers. America is also the home of a great number of Indian tribes, original inhabitants of the United States of America. Say, traditionally they have been called Red Indians also. And now there is this term that Native Indians or Amerindians. So there are hundreds of languages which are spoken by those native Indians. Many of those languages actually feared extinction. They were dying out. And many American linguists, they tried to study those languages. So you can see here this relationship between anthropology and linguistics. They were interested in those tribes. They were interested in the life patterns of those tribes, and they were also interested in the linguistic nature of that society. So when they studied those societies, when they studied those Indian languages, they discovered certain very important principles. Now, one very important principle was that when they tried to teach certain sounds to those Indians, then Indians could probably pronounce those sounds or learn those sounds only when there was a kind of parallel pattern of those sounds in their language. Parallel patterns of those sounds in their language. And other sounds they could not distinguish. And here, this is not very difficult to explain. How often we find certain sounds difficult to pronounce. Say, you hear somebody speaking Tamil, you hear somebody speaking any South Indian language, or say South Indians often when they speak Urdu or when they speak, you say that, oh, he is South Indian. Why? Because there are certain patterns in South Indian languages. So if those patterns are not there in their language, then they have to learn actually these patterns. So any person who is new to a language finds it very difficult to learn all possible patterns. And you see, we often make jokes also of some people pronouncing words, say in a certain manner, because it also requires some kind of training. So those linguists, they studied these Indian languages and they tried to teach those Indian certain sounds, and Indians could produce those sounds only when there were patterns of such sounds in their own language. Otherwise, they could not probably distinguish between two different sounds. Then there was another very interesting insight that they learned. And what was that insight? This insight is that our language, for example, does not simply reflect our world, it constitutes our world. So if I speak a particular language, then that language also presents a particular kind of worldview. Any different language probably give a different kind of worldview. In the classroom, I gave one example, and you can possibly have this example from the area of translation studies also, right? That when a particular word becomes untranslatable, what is the meaning of something which is considered untranslatable? Because meaning is often result of culture also. Susan Bassnett, he wrote this famous book, Translation Studies. It has a very interesting example, and I'm trying to, are you following me? I'm trying to adapt this example to our own context. If you use the word butter, and I ask you to translate the word butter, you'll say makhan. If you are Urdu speaking or Hindi speaking. But if we probe further, we'll find that, okay, if you use the word makhan, what exactly is the texture of that makhan? What is the color of that makhan? What is the use of that makhan? What is the taste of that makhan? And suddenly differences arise, because butter, you may think about something which is yellow, which is a bit firm, yellow, firm, salted, processed, and probably used to say, you use it at your breakfast table with bread. And makhan, maybe it is white, maybe it is not very firm, maybe it is homemade, maybe it is not processed, maybe it is used in villages, maybe it has little to do with say city cultures. Differences arise. So the word makhan connotes a very different worldview, and the word connotes very different worldview. And further, do you use makhan for the purpose of cooking, or do you use makhan or butter for the purpose of cooking? Then that is a further line of difference. Similarly, we can think about many other culture specific words, and so a language also probably has a kind of worldview. So when those Indian languages were studied, linguists realized that language also constituted the worldview. Language also constituted the world of those Indians. So it is not simply a matter of certain sounds. It is also something which is as deep as our worldview. Now these are called descriptive linguists, or this is called descriptive linguistics, because they were not passing any value judgment. Rather, their task was to describe those languages. Their task was to describe the patterns of those languages. So American structural linguists performed a job which is in line with the ideas of Ferdinand de Saussure, although they reached their conclusions independently. So whereas Saussure reached certain conclusions through his study, American linguists, and who are these important names? Say there is the name of Worf, there is the name of Sapir, Worf and Sapir. These are important names, and there is the name of Bloomfield. So Bloomfield, Worf, Sapir. There is also this term Worf Sapir hypothesis. They studied language. They are called American structural linguists, and this whole area is called, say, descriptive linguistics. Descriptive linguistics, that is one aspect. That is one, say, variety of linguistic study. The second variety of linguistic study is which developed at Copenhagen, and that is called glissematic linguistics. Glissematic linguistics. It developed at Copenhagen. And one very important name associated with this variety is Genslave. Genslave. And the spelling is H-J-E-L-M, H-J-E-L-M-S-L-E-V. H-J-E-L-M-S-L-E-V. Now, what is his emphasis? And I'm quoting his words. For every process, there is a corresponding system by which the process can be analyzed and described by means of a limited number of premises. So he had a formal view of language, and what he's saying that for, I'm repeating, say, his words, and this is a quote: for every process, there is a corresponding system by which the process can be analyzed. So something similar, that there is a process and there is a corresponding process with which, say, that process can be analyzed and described by means of a limited number of premises. So maybe just a small premise, but then it can help the study of language.